I left everything in Nigeria to follow him to Canada. He had a wife already waiting there. I want you to stop whatever you are doing right now and listen carefully, because what I am about to tell you happened to a real woman. A woman who gave up her job, her apartment, her family, her entire life in Lagos, packed everything into 2 suitcases, and flew across the ocean to be with a man who had already made other plans. A man who smiled at her at the airport, held her hand like she was the most precious thing he had ever touched, and then drove her straight to a house where another woman was already cooking in the kitchen. Her name was Adaeze, and this is exactly how it happened. Adaeze Okonkwo was 31 years old when she met Emeka Nwosu at a mutual friend's birthday party in Victoria Island, Lagos. She was not the kind of woman who fell easily. She had a finance degree from the University of Lagos, a steady job at a mid-size accounting firm in Lekki, and a one-bedroom apartment she had furnished herself, piece by piece, over 4 years of working. She was the kind of woman her mother pointed to when lecturing younger cousins about independence. She did not need a man to pay her bills. She had standards. She had plans. But Emeka walked into that party in a navy blue blazer, smelling like something expensive, and something in Adaeze shifted. He was tall. He was articulate. He had one of those laughs that sounded like it came from a completely honest place, not performed, not manufactured for the crowd. And within 20 minutes of talking to him, Adaeze realized he was also genuinely intelligent. He asked her questions and then actually listened to the answers. He remembered details. When she mentioned offhand that she hated sweet cocktails, he flagged the waiter without her asking and ordered her something drier. Small thing, but she noticed. He was visiting Lagos from Toronto. He had moved to Canada 3 years earlier for a master's degree in engineering and had stayed on, building a career at a construction firm in the city. He was home for his cousin's birthday, planning to stay for 2 weeks before flying back. When Adaeze and Emeka exchanged numbers at the end of that night, neither of them expected anything serious, but they talked every single day. First, it was WhatsApp messages here and there, then voice notes that stretched to 10 and 15 minutes, then video calls that started at 9 in the evening and ended after midnight because neither of them wanted to say goodnight. Adaeze told her best friend Chiamaka that she had met someone, and Chiamaka, who had watched Adaeze brush off 3 perfectly decent men in the last 2 years, immediately flew to conclusions. "This one has done something to you," Chiamaka said. "Your face is different." "Don't be dramatic," Adaeze said, but she was smiling and she knew it. After 2 months of long-distance communication, Emeka came back to Lagos for a full week. He booked himself into a hotel in Ikoyi and spent every evening with Adaeze. He took her to dinner. He met Chiamaka and charmed her completely. He even drove with Adaeze to visit her parents in Surulere one Sunday afternoon, which was the kind of gesture that meant something. Her father shook his hand. Her mother, who was famously difficult to impress, sent him home with a container of egusi soup. That was when Adaeze stopped pretending she was not in love. The relationship moved with a momentum that felt both thrilling and natural at the same time. Emeka called her his person. He talked about the future in concrete terms, not vague romantic haze, but specifics. "When you come to Toronto," he would say, not if. He talked about neighborhoods he wanted to show her, a restaurant in Scarborough he was saving for when she arrived, a winter coat he wanted to buy her because he knew she had never experienced real cold, and he wanted to be there when she felt snow for the first time. She told herself this was a man who knew what he wanted. 8 months into the relationship, he asked her directly. He was on a video call from what appeared to be his apartment in Toronto. She could see the bookshelf behind him, the small kitchen lamp she had seen in dozens of previous calls. He said he wanted her to come, not for a visit. He wanted her to come and build a life with him there. He had looked into the spousal sponsorship process and said they would get her documents processed properly, but in the meantime, she could come on a visitor's visa, stay with him, and they would move through the paperwork together. "I am not proposing yet," he said with that honest laugh, "but I will be. I just want us to be in the same place first. I am tired of watching you on a screen." Adaeze cried, quietly, after the call ended, not from sadness, from the terrifying relief of realizing that someone had looked at her, really looked at her, and decided she was worth the trouble of building something permanent. The next 3 months were consumed by logistics. She gave notice at her accounting firm. Her boss tried to convince her to stay, offered a small raise, which she declined politely. She gave up her apartment. She sorted her belongings into 3 categories: things to ship, things to give away, things to carry. She went to the Canadian High Commission and secured her visitor's visa without difficulty. She had stable employment history, savings, and a clean record. Emeka sent her the address of his apartment and told her he had cleared out half the wardrobe for her. He sent her a photo of the empty side of the wardrobe. She screenshot it and sent it to Chiamaka. Her mother cried at the airport. Her father held her tightly and said, "He better be a good man." Her youngest brother, who was 17, told her to bring him a Canada Goose jacket. She laughed and promised she would try. On the flight from Lagos to Toronto, Adaeze did not sleep. She sat with her headphones in and watched the flight map on the screen in front of her, watching the tiny airplane icon inch across the Atlantic. She felt the way she imagined people felt before major surgery, terrified and hopeful in equal, indistinguishable measure. She landed at Pearson International Airport on a Thursday morning in November. She had been awake for nearly 20 hours. Her hair was in a neat braid she had done the night before departure. She had worn a burgundy sweater because she had read that Canadian airports could be cold. She cleared customs and immigration without incident, collected her 2 suitcases, and walked through the arrival doors into the public area. Emeka was standing there. He was in a gray coat, holding a small paper with her name written on it as a joke, like a driver at a fancy hotel, and when she saw him, all the fear drained out of her body at once. He folded her into a hug that lasted a long time. She could feel him exhale against her shoulder. "You're here," he said. "I'm here," she said. He carried both her suitcases. He was warm and attentive during the drive, pointing things out to her: the expressway, the CN Tower in the distance when they approached the city, the particular gray-white color of a Toronto winter sky. She pressed her face to the window like a child. He held her hand on his knee while he drove, and then he took an exit she had not been expecting. She did not know Toronto, so she had no way to know which exits were right and which were not, but she noticed that the drive kept going. She had expected his apartment to be somewhere central. She had looked up the postal code he had given her, and it had appeared to be in the downtown core. But they were now driving through what looked like a residential suburb: wider roads, houses with driveways, bare trees lining both sides of the street. "Your apartment is in this area?" she asked. He answered without looking at her. "I moved," he said. "I found a better place. More space. You'll like it." She accepted this. It was reasonable. She relaxed. He pulled into the driveway of a detached house on a quiet street. The house was not large, but it was proper. Brick front, 2 stories, a small porch, a minivan parked to the side. Adaeze noted the minivan briefly. She assumed it belonged to a neighbor. She was wrong. Emeka carried her suitcases to the front door and opened it with his key. The warmth of the house hit her immediately. So did a smell. Something cooking, something with tomatoes and spice, something that smelled like Nigerian food. And then a woman appeared at the end of the hallway. She was wearing an apron over a casual dress. She was Igbo like Emeka. She was around Adaeze's age, possibly a little older. She had the look of a woman who was completely at home in that house, because she was. She looked at Adaeze with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite hostility. It was something flatter and more devastating than both. It was recognition. Adaeze stood very still. Emeka, to his infinite shame, said nothing for a moment that stretched like pulled elastic, and then he said, "Adaeze, this is Ngozi. Ngozi, this is my friend Adaeze from Lagos. She just arrived." Friend. The word landed in Adaeze's chest like a stone into water. She heard it. She counted the syllables. She held the word in her mind and turned it over, and felt everything she had built over the last 11 months rearranging itself into a completely different shape. She did not scream. She did not cry. She did not throw anything, though she would later say she briefly considered it. She stood in the hallway of that house in a Toronto suburb, with her 2 suitcases at her feet, and her father's voice in her head saying, "He better be a good man." And she understood with a terrible, full-body clarity that she had been deceived. Ngozi was Emeka's wife, not girlfriend, not ex, not complicated situation, wife. They had been married for 2 years. They had a son together who was 14 months old and was apparently napping upstairs, which was why the house was quiet. Adaeze discovered all of this not from Emeka, who offered nothing, but from Ngozi herself. Because here is the part that Adaeze had not anticipated. Ngozi was also a victim. Ngozi knew that Emeka had been making frequent trips to Lagos in the last year. He had told her they were work-related visits. His firm was allegedly pursuing a project partnership with a Lagos-based engineering company. He had told her he was networking. He had been sending money home to Lagos regularly, which Ngozi had assumed was family obligation, something she understood as a Nigerian woman, something she had never questioned. What she had not known, until Adaeze appeared in her hallway, was what the money was actually for. Emeka had been funding Adaeze's relocation, the visa fees, the shipping costs, probably even some of her living expenses in the months she was preparing to leave. Ngozi had not known. Adaeze had not known about Ngozi. The only person in the room who held the complete picture was Emeka, who was now standing between his wife and the woman he had lured across an ocean, and he had the audacity to look uncomfortable rather than destroyed. That evening was one of the strangest, most harrowing evenings of Adaeze's life. Ngozi did not ask Adaeze to leave. She sat her down in the kitchen. She made tea, not because anyone particularly wanted tea, but because human beings in crisis reach for familiar rituals, and the kettle was there. She asked Adaeze to tell her everything, and Adaeze, who was in shock, who had nowhere to go, and no one in this country, and very little grip on what was real, told her. She told Ngozi about the birthday party in Victoria Island, about the months of calls, about giving up her apartment and her job, about her mother crying at the airport. She laid the whole 11 months on the table between them like evidence at a hearing. Ngozi listened without interrupting. She was quiet for a long time after Adaeze finished. Then she said, very carefully, "He used to travel to Lagos before we had the baby too. I always thought it was work." "It may have been, sometimes," Adaeze said, for reasons she could not fully explain. Maybe she felt that cruelty was not something she wanted to add to the room. Maybe she was still, at some deeply irrational level, protecting him. She hated herself for it the moment she said it. Emeka had left the kitchen. He had taken himself to the living room and sat there in the manner of a man who understood that whatever came next, he had no right to manage it. The women talked for 3 hours. By the end of it, Ngozi had called her sister in Mississauga. Adaeze was going to stay with Ngozi's sister for a few days. Not because this was ideal, not because any of this was anything except an emergency measure, but because it was the only option that existed at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night in November, in a city Adaeze had arrived in 12 hours ago. Ngozi's sister Obiageli came and picked Adaeze up without asking many questions, because Ngozi had clearly explained enough on the phone that asking questions felt inappropriate. In the car, Obiageli said, "You are not the first woman this kind of thing has happened to, and you will not be the last. But you are here now. That means something." Adaeze stared out the window and watched Toronto pass by in the dark, the streetlights and the strip malls and the bare-limbed trees, and tried to locate something inside herself that felt like a next step. She could not find it. Not yet. The night Adaeze slept at Obiageli's apartment, the very first night, she lay on the pull-out couch in the dark and did something she would later describe as the strangest thing she had ever done in a crisis. She went through every single memory of Emeka in her head, from the birthday party in Victoria Island to the airport hug that morning, and she tried to identify the exact moment the lie had been happening. Not when it started. She suspected it had started before they ever met, that the capacity to sustain that kind of deception was structural in a man, built into him over time. But the moment she could have seen it, if she had been looking for it. She found 3 moments. The first was a phone call she had made to him 3 months in, unannounced, at an hour slightly earlier than their usual call time. He had picked up, sounded briefly disoriented in a way she had chalked up to tiredness, and then almost immediately excused himself to call her back from a different room. She had thought nothing of it. She was filing it now. The second was when she had asked, casually, if she could add him on Instagram. He had said he was not really active on social media, that he preferred to keep his digital life minimal. This from a man who had a professional LinkedIn that was current and detailed. She had accepted the explanation. She was filing that too. The third was the most telling, and the most damning of herself in retrospect. When she had raised the question of meeting his friends in Toronto, she had wanted to know the people in his life there, had said as much. He had deflected with warmth and humor, and said that his Canadian friends were boring engineers who would embarrass him, that he'd rather she met them gradually once she arrived. She had laughed. She had found it charming. She was filing it now without laughter. She lay in the dark and understood that the signs had been visible. She had chosen each time to read them charitably. She had done this because she loved him, and when you love someone, you give their ambiguities the best possible interpretation. She had not been stupid. She had been loving. These were not the same thing, but they were easily confused from the inside. This understanding did not make her feel better, but it made her feel honest, which was the necessary foundation for everything that had to come next. Let us pause here for a moment, because this is the part of the story where people usually expect Adaeze to fall apart completely. And she did fall apart, but not in the way you might imagine. She did not go into a depression that lasted months. She did not call Emeka begging. She did not book a return flight to Lagos in a panic. What she did was something quieter and ultimately much more powerful. She sat with the truth. She spent her first week in Canada sleeping on Obiageli's pull-out couch in Mississauga, eating the food that Obiageli silently placed in front of her, and slowly taking stock of what she actually had. She had herself. She had a valid visitor's visa with 5 months remaining. She had savings, not enormous, but real, in a Nigerian dollar account. She had a finance degree. She had years of professional experience in accounting. She had a working phone. She had a brain that, once it finished grieving, was perfectly functional. Obiageli was not an overly expressive woman. She showed care through action rather than conversation. She left a new toothbrush on the bathroom shelf on Adaeze's first morning without comment. She put a spare house key on the kitchen table on the 3rd day without explanation. When she came home from work on the 5th day and found Adaeze sitting with a notepad making calculations, she set a plate of leftover rice beside her, looked at the notepad briefly, and said, "Good, keep going." Then she went to her room. Adaeze would remember Obiageli later with the kind of gratitude that cannot be fully articulated. Sometimes, the most important people in the worst periods of your life are not the ones who cry with you and give speeches. Sometimes, they are the ones who simply refuse to treat you as though you are broken. She called Chiamaka back in Lagos and told her everything. Chiamaka, who had a way of being enraged on behalf of people she loved that was almost medicinal, provided the kind of reaction that genuinely helped, furious, loyal, and ending ultimately with, "So what are you going to do now?" That question was the turning point. Because Adaeze had spent a week asking herself what had been done to her, and Chiamaka, with the simple bluntness of a best friend, redirected her to what she was going to do next. She made a list. She did this on a Tuesday afternoon while Obiageli was at work and the apartment was quiet. She wrote at the top of the paper, "I am in Canada. What now?" Below it she wrote, "Find an immigration lawyer. Understand my actual options. Look into Canadian accounting certification equivalency. Research employment possibilities on a visitor's visa. Extend the visa if possible." She wrote these things not with hope exactly. Hope felt too tender, too exposed, but with the deliberate efficiency of a woman who understood that the alternative to moving forward was drowning. She called an immigration lawyer that same week. The consultation was paid, $60 for 30 minutes, and she spent every second of it asking precise questions and taking notes. The lawyer told her that her visitor's visa gave her legal status in Canada, but not the right to work. She could, however, apply for a study permit, which would allow her to enroll in a program and potentially qualify for a work permit after. There were also pathways through express entry, depending on her points profile. Her finance background and work experience were assets. Her English proficiency was not in question. It was not a simple road, but it was a road. In the meantime, she needed money. She reached out to her professional network in Lagos, and within 2 weeks had secured 2 remote freelance contracts doing bookkeeping and financial reporting for companies back home. She worked from Obiageli's kitchen table. She bought herself a notebook and wrote her monthly budget. She found a free settlement services organization in Mississauga that provided newcomers with employment counseling, legal clinics, and language support. She began attending their workshops, not because she needed language support, but because she needed information, and information was free. Obiageli watched all of this quietly. She began to bring Adaeze better coffee in the mornings, small gesture. But Adaeze noticed. Now, during all of this, things were unraveling completely for Emeka. Ngozi had not thrown him out immediately. She had done something more considered than that. She had waited. She had spoken to her own family. She had spoken to a lawyer. And then, approximately 3 weeks after Adaeze had appeared in her hallway, Ngozi had a conversation with Emeka that was so final, so precisely delivered, that he reportedly sat in the kitchen for 2 hours afterward without moving. She told him she was filing for divorce. She told him she would be seeking full custody of their son. She told him that she had already spoken to his parents in Enugu, not to embarrass him, but because she believed his family deserved to know the kind of man they had raised, and that his mother had called her weeping. His mother had also called Adaeze through a network of contacts that took 3 days to trace, and had apologized in the trembling voice of a woman who was ashamed in the deepest, most personal way, the shame of a parent who raised something and does not recognize what it became. Adaeze had accepted the apology without warmth, but without cruelty. She had nothing to say to Emeka's mother, except that she was sorry it was happening to her family too. She told him that she had loved him without reservation for 3 years, and that he had taken that love and used it as cover for a deception that had harmed not one woman but two. And then she asked him to leave. He left. Word got back to Nigeria the way these things always do, through family, through quiet phone calls, through the invisible network of Igbo women who have always protected each other across generations and continents. Emeka's reputation in his community in Toronto was destroyed within a month. At the church they attended in Scarborough, people knew. At the professional association events he used to frequent, people knew. His closest male friend, a man named Tobena, who had been his groomsman, stopped returning his calls. The engineering company he worked for did not fire him. The deception was personal, not professional, but the workplace social fabric around him changed. People were cordial and nothing more. He had become a cautionary tale while he was still walking around living his life, which is possibly the most uncomfortable form of consequence. Emeka tried once to reach Adaeze. He sent a message through a mutual contact in Lagos, asking if she was all right. She read it. She did not respond. She was not all right, and she was also not interested in performing okayness for the person responsible. Adaeze found her footing. Not overnight, not in a straight line, but with the accumulation of small daily decisions that added up to a life. She enrolled in a postgraduate certificate program in financial planning at a college in Mississauga. This gave her a study permit and a part-time work permit that allowed her to work up to 20 hours per week off campus. She got a part-time position at a financial services firm owned by a Nigerian-Canadian man named Mr. Adeyemi, who had come to Canada 18 years earlier with $40 and a suitcase and had no patience for pity but enormous respect for work ethic. He hired her after a 15-minute conversation and told her she could increase her hours once her permit allowed it. She would later say that working for Mr. Adeyemi was one of the most important experiences of her first years in Canada. Not because of the salary, which was modest, but because of what it modeled. He had come here with nothing and had built something real through stubbornness and competence and the refusal to be diminished by circumstance. He never said any of this directly. He did not give speeches. He simply worked the way a man works when he intends to win. And being in proximity to that kind of quiet determination recalibrated something in Adaeze. She moved into a shared apartment with two other Nigerian women, Kemi, who was studying nursing, and Priscilla, who worked in logistics. Their apartment was small and perpetually cold, and the landlord was unresponsive about the radiator, but there was a warmth in that space that had nothing to do with heating. They cooked together on Sunday evenings, they shared Wi-Fi and grocery runs, and the particular solidarity of women who are building something in a foreign country without a safety net. Kemi had come from Ibadan, Priscilla was from Bayelsa. They were not the same kind of women, came from different backgrounds, spoke different languages at home, but they were all here, in this cold apartment in this city, doing the daily work of becoming. That was enough for a powerful bond. On her 25th day in that apartment, Adaeze sat on the kitchen floor after dinner and laughed, genuinely, unguardedly laughed, at something Kemi said, and then stopped because she had not laughed that way since before she boarded the plane in Lagos, and the sudden return of it was so unexpected it made her eyes water. Kemi looked at her and said, "Welcome back." She called her parents. Not immediately. It took her 6 weeks to gather the courage. Her father answered. She told him the truth. She did not spare herself the embarrassment of the full story. She heard her father breathe very carefully on the other end of the line for a long time. He said, "Are you safe?" "Yes," she said. "Are you housed?" Do you have food? Are you working? Yes, yes, and yes. Then you are okay, he said. Everything else is just a story that happened to you. You get to decide what comes after. Her mother came on the line next and cried, which made Adaeze cry, and they cried together for a while across the Atlantic. And then her mother asked if she had been eating properly, and told her to drink warm water in the morning, and told her that she had lit a candle at the church, and told her that she was proud of her. For what? Adaeze asked. I left everything and came here for a man who had a wife. No, her mother said firmly. You came here because you were brave enough to choose a life. The man was not the life. The life is still there. You are still there. There is a detail in this story that Adaeze would only share years later, and it is the kind of detail that changes the entire color of the thing. About 3 months after she arrived in Toronto, she was at a newcomer networking event organized by the settlement organization she had been attending. It was held in a community center, folding tables, printed name tags, bad coffee, the kind of event that felt useless until it didn't. She was standing with a cup of coffee she was not drinking when someone tapped her shoulder. It was a man, Nigerian, early to mid-30s, with an easy smile and a slight Yoruba accent when he introduced himself. His name was Damilola. He worked in project management. He had come to Canada 5 years earlier. He said, "You look like someone who is deciding whether this event is worth staying for." "I'm deciding," she said. "So am I," he said. "We can decide together." They stayed for another hour and a half. He was not pushy. He was not performing. He asked her how long she had been in Canada, and when she said 3 months, he said, "Still figuring it out?" And she said, "Every day." And he said, "That's the only honest answer." He gave her his card, an actual physical business card, which she privately found endearing and slightly dated, and said that he ran an informal group for Nigerian professionals in the GTA that met once a month for networking and food, and asked if she wanted to be added to the mailing list. She said yes. She did not fall in love with Damilola immediately. She was nowhere near ready for anything like that. But she went to the monthly group. She built a network. She learned the city. She got her certification. She got a full-time offer from Mr. Adeyemi's firm. She got her work permit. She filed for permanent residency through the provincial nominee program, and when her lawyer called to tell her that her application had been approved, she went to the bathroom at work and allowed herself to cry for exactly 4 minutes before washing her face, going back to her desk, and finishing the quarterly report that was due by 5. Here is what she learned, and this is the part of the story that matters beyond the betrayal, beyond the drama, beyond the outrage that is completely justified. Here is what she actually learned. She learned that she had been in love with the idea of Emeka before she was in love with Emeka. She had been in love with the way he saw her, or the way she believed he saw her. She had been in love with the future he described, the ready-made story of immigration and love and building something together. She had wanted it so much that she had stopped interrogating the evidence. There were signs she had not allowed herself to read. He had never video called her from anything except the one corner of his apartment where the bookshelf was. He had always been vague about his address until she needed it for her visa application. He had never introduced her to any friends in Canada. All his social introductions happened in Lagos, on his turf, where he controlled the information. His calls had always been in the evening, Lagos time, which was daytime Toronto time. Convenient if a man was calling from work and not from a home where a wife might overhear. She had filed these observations away in a drawer labeled "Being Reasonable" and left them there. She understood now that being reasonable with someone who is being deceptive is not a virtue. It is a vulnerability that the deceptive person depends on. She also learned that she was harder than she knew. This was the more surprising discovery. She had spent 31 years thinking of herself as relatively sensitive, someone who needed stability, someone for whom uprooting was a form of violence. And then she had been spectacularly uprooted by deception in a foreign country in November, and she had not collapsed. She had made a list. She had found a lawyer. She had found a couch. She had found a classroom and a job and an apartment and eventually a community. She was not hardened in the cold sense of the word. She could still feel things. But she had discovered the difference between being soft and being brittle. Soft things can be pressed and returned to their shape. Brittle things shatter at the first real pressure. She was soft. She had always been soft. She just had not needed to know it until now. 2.5 years after she arrived in Toronto, Adaeze was promoted to senior financial analyst at Mr. Adeyeme's firm. She bought herself a proper winter coat, not the one Emeka had promised to buy her, but one she chose herself, in a color she liked, with her own money. She wore it on a Saturday afternoon when Damilola took her to the restaurant in Scarborough that Emeka had once promised to save for her first winter in Toronto. It was a different restaurant, of course. She had never known which specific one Emeka meant, but somehow the symbolism still felt right. Sitting in Scarborough, eating jollof rice in the cold, in a city she had chosen to stay in long after the reason she originally came for had dissolved. She and Damilola had been seeing each other for almost a year by then. It was slow and careful, and nothing like the accelerating momentum of her relationship with Emeka. Damilola did not make sweeping declarations. He did not describe the future in cinematic terms. He showed up. He was consistent. When she told him, 4 months into whatever they were, the full story of how she had come to be in Canada, the whole thing, unedited, including the part where she stood in a hallway with her suitcases and heard herself called a friend. He listened without performing reactions. He did not interrupt. He did not hurry to fill the silences. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That took a lot to tell me." Not, "I'm so sorry," or "What a terrible man." Just an acknowledgement of her courage in the telling. She noted that. She filed it in a different drawer from the other notes she had taken about men. He met her friends, Kemi and Priscilla, who interrogated him separately and reported back to Adaeze with verdicts ranging from, "He is genuinely sweet," to, "I checked his LinkedIn and it is very well curated," which is either a good or a bad sign. Adaeze laughed and said she would take her chances. He met her parents on a video call. Her father asked him several questions about his employment and his family background, which Damilola answered with patience and good humor. Her mother, who had upgraded her assessment of herself to expert in spotting men with character since the Emeka situation, declared him clean-hearted. Adaeze trusted her mother's judgment. She had learned, lately, to trust more carefully and refuse less instinctively. These were different skills from the ones she had walked through the airport with 3 years ago, and they had cost her dearly to acquire, but they were hers. As for Ngozi, they stayed in touch. This was the part that Adaeze said people always found hardest to believe, but it made a certain kind of sense that was visible only when you understood what they had actually shared that night in that kitchen. They had shared the truth. They had shared tea and the shock of the same revelation, and the particular fury of having trusted the same man and been deceived in different but equally complete ways. They had not become best friends. They were not calling each other every day, but they were something. Ngozi finalized her divorce from Emeka 14 months after he left the house. She kept the house, which she had discovered was in both their names only because a lawyer had helped her look. She was raising her son, who had turned 2 and was beginning to say words with great enthusiasm and no discretion. She had gone back to work in healthcare administration. She had told Adaeze once, over coffee in a cafe near the Eaton Center, that she had spent a long time being furious, and a long time being sad, and had finally arrived somewhere that felt like being a person again. Adaeze understood exactly what she meant. She went back to Lagos for Christmas the second year. Her mother cooked enough food for a compound. Her youngest brother had grown taller than her and did not stop talking about the Canada Goose jacket she had managed to find at a second-hand shop and mailed to him 2 months earlier. Her father looked at her across the table at Christmas dinner, at her steady hands and clear eyes, and the absence of the anxious hopefulness she had been carrying when she left, and said quietly, "You came back different." "How?" she asked. "More yourself," he said. She did not have words for that at the table, but later, lying in her childhood bedroom, looking at a ceiling she had stared at as a teenager, she turned the phrase over and understood it. She had left Lagos as a woman defined largely in relation to other people, her job, her apartment, and then the man she was following across the ocean. She had arrived in Canada as a woman stripped of all of those definitions at once. And in the absence of all of them, with nothing to stand on except herself, she had discovered that she was in fact standing. She also noticed something she had not noticed when she lived here. The city looked different from this angle. Lagos had not changed, but she had, and so her relationship to the noise and the heat and the traffic and the food and the evenings, all of it had a texture she could now appreciate because she had been away, because she had seen cold and gray and the particular loneliness of a foreign city in November, and so the chaotic warmth of Lagos read now as a kind of gift. She went to her old neighborhood in Surulere and walked streets she had walked as a child, and she felt for the first time in years that she knew exactly where she came from and exactly where she was going. That clarity was worth something. Everything she had been through had purchased it. More herself. Yes, that was exactly it. The last thing Adaeze said about Emeka, the only thing she said about him that wasn't outrage or analysis or cautionary wisdom, was this, and she said it only once, quietly, to Chiamaka, who had come to visit her in Toronto the summer after her second year. "I am glad he was real enough to love, even if he was lying, because I am only here because I was capable of loving that completely. And being here made me everything I have become." Chiamaka was quiet for a moment. They were sitting on the balcony of Adaeze's apartment. Small balcony, plastic chairs, a view of the parking lot below, and a sliver of sky above it. And the summer air was warm in the way Toronto summer air is warm, which is nothing like Lagos warm, but is warm enough. "That," Chiamaka said finally, "is the most expensive self-awareness I have ever heard." Adaeze laughed, and this time she did not stop. She became a permanent resident of Canada on a Thursday afternoon in March. She did not make a speech or post a photo immediately. She sat in the immigration office after collecting her document and thought about the flight map she had watched on her first flight over. The tiny airplane moving across the Atlantic, inch by inch through the night. She thought about her suitcases in the hallway. She thought about the strange pivot of fate that had delivered her to a kitchen where a woman in an apron had looked at her with flat, devastated recognition, and how that moment, which had felt like the complete destruction of everything, had turned out to be the beginning of the only life that actually belonged to her. She picked up her phone. She called her mother. "Mummy," she said, "I got it." Her mother started crying immediately, which she had predicted. "My daughter," her mother said, "my strong, strong daughter." Adaeze walked out of the building into the cold March air. She put her permanent residency document carefully in the inside pocket of her coat, the coat she had chosen herself, and stood on the pavement for a moment, watching the traffic pass, watching the people move in all directions, watching the city go about its ordinary Thursday afternoon, completely unaware that a woman was standing on the pavement outside the immigration office, feeling the precise, quiet weight of having arrived. Not arrived in Canada. She had done that 2.5 years ago on a Thursday in November. Arrived as herself. That was the longer journey. That was the one that mattered. And it had been worth every single difficult, terrible, clarifying step. If you are a woman sitting somewhere right now who has given something enormous to a person who did not deserve the size of your trust, a job, an apartment, a relocation, a portion of your most careful years, I want you to hear this clearly. The giving was not the mistake. You were not foolish for being capable of that level of love. You were just loving across information you were not given. That is not your failure. It is their crime. But the question Chiamaka asked is the right one. Not what was done to you. What are you going to do now? Adaeze made a list. Start yours.